All right, so in the last lesson, we learned about how to create our very own Flutter app completely from scratch. And we built an I Am Rich and I Am Poor app. But in this module, we're going to take it much further. We're going to learn how to design your app's user interface using Flutter's layout widgets. And by the end of the module, you will have built a beautiful business card app that has all of your contact details on it, and you can get people to download it so that they'll have all your details on their phone. It's a really simple app in terms of functionality, but by building it, we're going to learn a lot about how to lay out user interface elements on screen using various Flutter layout widgets. So once you're ready, head over to this URL, github.com/londonaptbrewery/MiCard Now, of course, there's going to be a link to this in the course resources, so you can also click on that link. Now, once you're here, you'll discover the skeleton project for this coming module, and it includes things such as the app icons and images and resources that you'll need to be able to complete this module. So we're going to go ahead and clone it onto your local system by clicking on this green button, clone or download, and then you're going to click on this button to copy the URL of this repository. Now, once you've copied that, you're going to open up Android Studio, and on the welcome screen, you're going to click on Checkout Project from Version Control, and you're going to select Git as the provider. Now, where it says URL, you're going to paste in that repository URL that you copied just now. And in the second part where it says directory, it's asking you, where do you want this project to be cloned? So imagine that this process of cloning a repository being the same as, say, if I had emailed you a copy of the starter project and you had downloaded it and you decided where to put it on your computer. And this is effectively exactly the same thing, but it's so much more efficient. So choose where you want your project to be saved. You can, of course, click on this little icon to change that if you wanted to save it onto your desktop or wherever. Now, once you're ready, go ahead and click on Clone for it to download that starter file and put it onto your computer. Now, at this point, you might get a pop-up that asks you whether if you want Android Studio to create a project for you based on the files that you just downloaded, and you're going to select No. Instead, we're going to open up an existing Android Studio project. So we're going to click on that button and you're going to navigate to where you had cloned that previous project, MiCard Flutter. So remember, in my case, I put it into a folder called Android Studio Project, and that's where I see it now. If you change that destination to your desktop or wherever it may be, that is also where you're going to locate this particular project. Now, select on the folder that contains all of your project files, such as your lib, your iOS, your Android, and then go ahead and click Open. And Android Studio is going to do some magic behind the scenes to open up this project as a Flutter project. Now, the first thing you see when you open it up is a whole bunch of errors from Dart Analysis. Says, I don't know about this, I don't know about that. And the reason is because before we do anything, we have to get our dependencies. So remember that our Flutter project relies on a lot of the libraries and code from the Flutter team. So if we click on Get Dependencies, that will download and get everything that we need in order for our project to be set up. So now we are all ready. We have no errors, no warnings, and everything is all good to go. So that was the entire process of taking a starter file that I've created and getting it downloaded and set up on your local system. Now, GitHub is one of the largest repositories for open source code. So if you need some inspiration and you wanted to see how other people's code look, you can go ahead and just search for other Flutter projects. Say, just put in the word Flutter, and you can see that there's 25,000 repositories, so 25,000 places where you can find other people's Flutter projects. And if you scroll down this, you'll find really cool apps that other people have built. For example, the history of everything that was demoed at the Flutter conference last year, where you can see all their animations and timelines and all sorts of crazy things that people have generated using Flutter. So whenever you come across something that you quite like to see the code for, or you want to run it locally, then you're going to go through that same process that we went through just now. And we're going to be doing it frequently when I give you starting files with all the resources pre-packaged. So you're going to get used to this pretty soon. Now back to Android Studio. So we've set up our starting file and we are ready to go. If you want to just check and confirm, then just go ahead and run it on a device or simulator just to make sure that everything works. And once you're ready, head over to the next lesson when we're going to get started talking about hot reload and hot restart. Now, in the last module, when we built our I am rich and I am poor project, if you remember, we created our app inside our main function, which we know gets triggered when our code is run. Inside these curly braces is the starting point. And inside here, we've told the phone to run an app, which is a material app, and then we gave it various widgets to be displayed. So in this case, we've got a scaffold that has a background color and simply just an empty container as the body. Now, if you remember at the beginning when I told you about why Flutter is awesome, one of the things I talked about was this thing called hot reload, which allows you to almost instantaneously see your changes in the simulator or on your device that you're testing it on. That means if I was to go and change our color, instead of having a background of teal and I wanted to have a background of a red color, then I should be able to go and click on this button, which is hot reload, and it should change instantly, right? And you can see down here that it's initializing hot reload and it seems to have successfully reloaded everything. But why is our background not red? Why hasn't it changed? Well, the reason is because for hot reload to work, we have to have the things that we've changed inside a Flutter stateless or stateful widget. So let me show you what that looks like. In order to create a stateless widget, there's a really quick shortcut that Flutter gives us, which is if you type STLESS, so stateless, I guess, for short, it will automatically create you a new stateless widget. So if we go ahead and hit enter, you can see it writes a whole bunch of code for us. And this is the boilerplate code for building a stateless widget. And then we get to give it a name. So let's call this stateless widget, I don't know, my app. And instead of building our material app inside our run app project in the main function, we're going to go ahead and take it out. So we're going to highlight it up until we've got the comment where it says material app. And I'm going to hit Command X to cut. And then I'm going to paste it here where it says return. So instead of returning a simple container, I'm going to return an entire material app. And of course, we can't have a comma and a semicolon. I'm going to delete the comma. And instead of running that material app, including all of those things there, I'm simply going to say run app, and the app that we're going to run is my app. So you can see that this hasn't really changed our app at all. All it's done is we've separated out the part where we build our material app into a separate widget. And this is a stateless widget. Now, what a stateless widget comes with is this method called build. And this method gets called whenever we create a new version of this widget. That means that if I go ahead and change this color from, what was it, teal to red, and I click on the hot reload button, then it will go and check to see what was the code that was changed most recently, namely teal became red. It will look to see where the closest build function is, and it will rerun it. Now that we've done this, let's go ahead and stop our app and run it again. So we're restarting it from fresh. And this means that our app is going to be created again using this stateless widget instead of simply just returning a material app. You can see right now our background has been changed to red, but this is not very interesting. We always knew that we could stop our app and run our app and wait a million seconds for that to happen. But here's the cool thing. Now that we've got our material app inside a stateless widget, which has a build method, which can be called every time we make a change to one of the widgets inside this build method. So let's change that color from red to blue. This is the part of the code that will get marked as changed. And as soon as I click on this button for Flutter Hot Reload, you'll see that the changes move over almost instantaneously. And it's because that all the app is doing is, instead of compiling all of the code, linking everything together, figuring out where the app icons are, which platform it's being run on, instead of all of that, it just calls this method again. And it rebuilds our material app with the scaffold with the changes. This is why it can be so fast. And remember that you don't actually have to click on this button. By default, Flutter's Hot Reload is hardwired to happen when you save your project. So let's change the color again. Let's change it to white. And as soon as I hit Command S on Mac or Control S on Windows, and I save my project, it automatically runs Hot Reload, and we get all the content refreshed almost immediately, which for anybody who's done any sort of mobile development with iOS, Android, Xamarin, whatever it may be, this is almost magical. And the idea really is that hot reload is meant to happen so fast, and it really is like a reload, like when you refresh your website as you're creating it. And what this will allow developers to do is to almost paint their user interface into life. Right? Say if you were creating a drawing or creating a painting, you see the changes immediately as soon as your pen hits paper. And even though hot reload is not instantaneous, like when you put a brush on paper, but it reduces that lag to fractions of a second, which means that developers are more inclined to use hot reload to see the changes that happen after every change they make. And this means that you get less errors because you haven't waited for a whole day before you rerun your app and you realize that there's 10 things that have broken. So we're going to be using the power of hot reload to massively reduce the amount of time for each development cycle. So let's imagine a development cycle being we write code and then we test code. We run it, we see what happens. And then we look at the difference between what we expected to happen and what actually happens on screen. And then we go back and we change our code, we write more code. And this goes on until infinity, or until your app is done. And what Flutter allows us to do is to massively shorten the time that's taken to create that cycle for each of those cycles. And previously, when you saw me creating this floating action button, I created the button, I hit save, it updates. I change the background color, I hit save, it updates. I add an icon to the button and I hit save and it updates as well. So for every single line of code, when I'm creating the user interface, I'm just painting it onto my app and seeing the result in fractions of seconds, so almost live. This means that you can really experiment with how you want the screen to look. Let's see if, for example, let's move this thing to the left a bit, see how that looks, or change the color of that thing through, all the rainbows of colors and see how that looks and see whether if you like it. If not, change it, and then it updates in a fraction of a second. When we're developing apps natively for iOS or Android, the only real option that we have is running the app from cold. Now, I want to show you, even on a fast iOS simulator, running on one of the latest MacBook Pros, so it has a lot of processing power. I want to show you just how long this takes, right? So I'm stopping, I'm starting, and we're just watching that timer go. And you can see in the console that things are happening. It's launching the code, it's starting the build, it's compiling our code, turning the human readable code that we've written into ones and zeros that the machine can actually understand, and then launching our app onto the simulator. And in total, I counted that took about 30 seconds to actually show up on screen. It really took a long time. And imagine that if you had changed just the color of the floating action button on the bottom right, you probably are not inclined to spend 30 seconds waiting to see how it's changed, right? Now, let's consider if instead we were creating a Flutter app and we now have access to our hot reload. Now, the same thing, changing a color, Instead of hitting run, I'm going to hit hot reload, and it's a matter of seconds. It took 5 seconds for that app bar background to change. And the beauty of this is that it doesn't even lose the state of the app. So all of the things that you've done for testing, say if I've changed the number of donuts eaten in the app, it's reading as 10, but I decide to change the background color of the app bar to red, and I hit hot reload. Almost instantaneously, my background color changes, but the rest of the data that I've inputted hasn't reset itself. Which means that if you're testing something like a form, or you're testing something where you don't want to lose the data that you've used to test the app, but you wanted to make some sort of UI change, then hot reload won't lose that data for you. And we're going to see this come into action a little bit later on as we get to develop more and more complex apps. Now, what is this button that's next to the hot reload button? This little green one. Well, this is something that comes with Flutter as well, and it's called a hot restart. What this does is that it does, in fact, reset the state of your app. So if you needed to test your app from the start, so where number of donuts gets reset back down to 0, then this is the button that you would use instead. So I'm changing the background color, and then I'm pressing hot restart instead of hot reload. And you can see that in the console, it's doing exactly that. Now, it still doesn't take as long as actually starting the app from cold when you stop it and run it again. But it does, in fact, reset the state of our app. And you can see that not only does the background gets changed to blue, but also the number of donuts eaten gets reset back down to 0. And it only took 8 seconds for this to happen. So you might be wondering, well, okay, that's fair enough on a very simple app, right? Like, something that just counts the number of donuts that you've eaten. But what if I had a big app with thousands of lines of code? Then surely, hot reload and hot restart won't really be very useful for me there. Well, actually, it still is. Because of the way that hot reload and hot restart work, what they do is they will only look at the changes that were made, and they will push those changes onto your testing device, your simulator or your iPhone. It's almost kind of like if you're somebody like me who travels a lot, I actually have a suitcase that's pre-packed with pretty much all the things that I always need when I go traveling, like toothbrush, toothpaste, my, a couple of pair of socks and those kind of things. And depending on where I go, I might add a few things or remove a few things. Say if I'm going somewhere that's quite warm, I might add a pair of sunglasses. So it's only the changes that I'm making to my suitcase that gets put into the suitcase. And this means I save myself a lot of time. Instead of packing my suitcase from scratch, I'm only adding the changes that I need for a particular destination. And this is how hot reload and hot restart works. So in this case, size doesn't actually matter. It doesn't matter if you are packing for a small suitcase or a giant suitcase, as long as you already have the suitcase packed and you're only adding to it one thing or two things, depending on which destination you're going to, then it doesn't actually take any longer to pack a larger suitcase or a smaller suitcase. And this is the same for our Flutter code. Even if we're hot reloading for changes that we've made to a really complex, large project, it will still be just as fast as doing it for a tiny project like this one here. And in the coming lessons, we're going to be using hot reload and hot restart to almost instantly see the changes that we're making with our code in our simulator. In the next lesson, that's exactly what we're going to be building. We're going to be building out our container and seeing all of the cool things that you can use it to do. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in this lesson, I want to talk to you about one of the most fundamental widgets that we're going to be using all the time to lay out our apps, and that is a container widget. Now, a container widget, for those of you guys who have done a little bit of web development or web design, is very similar to a div. It's essentially just a layout box. You can position it and move it around on the screen, and then you can give it a child to display, such as an image or a piece of text. Now, whenever you're using a new widget from Flutter, my top tip is to always start with the documentation. As I said previously, Flutter's documentation is really good, and all you have to do to find it is head over to flutter.dev, and we're going to go over to the widget catalog. And again, you'll find this URL to get here directly in the course resources. Now, once you're here, you can see that the team has organized all of the widgets based on what they do. And we've already seen some of the images and assets widgets, but now we're going to be looking at the layout section. And these are the widgets that allows you to arrange other widgets. So how to position things on screen. And under the layout widgets, you can see that they are split by single child widgets and multi-child widgets. A widget that can contain a single widget, say a piece of text or an image, or lots of different widgets, such as 5 images or an image and a piece of text. And in this module, we're going to be exploring both single child and multi-child widgets to learn how to lay out your screen exactly the way that you want it to look. The most commonly used single child widget is probably going to be a container. And if we click on it, we get taken to the container class. And this is a widget that allows us to position other widgets and size other widgets. And if you read through this, you'll learn a lot about exactly how it works. And one of the things that it tells you is that containers with no children try to be as big as possible. And this is exactly what we're seeing over here. We have a container that is currently trying to be as big as possible. How do we know that? Well, let's give it a color. Let's see it for ourselves. So let's go ahead and change this back to teal. And instantly we have our background using hot reload. And now inside the container, so inside these round brackets, I'm going to hit enter and I'm going to change its color. And here we get to specify a color for our container. Let's change our container to have a color of white. So now when I hit save and hot reload, you can see that my entire screen changes to white, even though we know that the background color is still teal. And the reason for this is because our container is taking up all of the space that's available. Exactly as described here. Containers with no children try to be as big as possible. Our container currently doesn't have anything inside the child property, so that's why it tries to be as big as possible. But what if we did give it a child? What if we gave it a child widget that's a piece of text, say that just says hello, right? Let's hit save, and immediately our container shrinks to the size of the child widget. And we could have known this by reading the documentation. Containers with children size themselves to their children's size. And our child in this case is the piece of text, and its size is determined by the font size of that piece of text. Now, at the moment, you can see that our piece of text is kind of hidden away a bit by the bezel of our iPhone screen, and on Android, depending on which device you're simulating it on, it might also have a notch like this. So how can we keep our content that we put on screen safe from all of these bordering elements like the top bar where we've got our time and our signal and our notch? Well, Flutter actually comes with a really simple widget that does exactly this. It's called a safe area, and anything that you put inside the safe area will be inside the parts which don't have a notch or an interactive area like this part on the iPhone here. In order to embed our container inside a safe area, we can hold down Option or Alt and hit Enter to pull up our intention actions here, our little menu. And I'm going to wrap our container, which is what's currently selected, inside a new widget. And all that does is it puts our previous container inside a new widget and it sets it as the child of that widget. So now we get to change this widget, and I'm going to call it a safe area with a capital S and a capital A. now, as soon as I hit save, you'll see my container moves in to the safe area, and it now only takes up the space where it's visible to the user. Whenever you're creating something for the user interface that you don't want to bleed all the way to the edges, but instead you want it to be fully visible to the user, then you're going to be using your safe area. What else can you do with your container? Well, we can also change its size, such as its width and its height. So if we just go ahead and add a new property called height, and let's set it to maybe 100 pixels, 100 points. And let's change the width also to 100. So now we should have 100 by 100, so a square container, as soon as I hit save. And there you go. We've got our square container with a single child. That is the piece of text that says hello. Now, what if I wanted my container to be a little bit offset from the edges of the screen? What if I wanted to set a margin for my container? Well, I can use the margin property. And to specify the margin property, we have to use something called edge insets. And you can see there's different types of insetting an edge. You can use the all, which means that whatever you enter here, let's say 20 pixels, is going to be set for all four sides of your container. So there's now a little margin of 20 for the left, the top, the right, and the bottom. Now, what if we didn't want that? What if we wanted to only set it for the top and the bottom? Well, then you can use symmetric. So now you can say that for the vertical axis, I want it to have, 50. But for the horizontal axis, I only want it to have 10 for the margin. So now if we hit save, you can see that it's offset from the top by 50, and from the left and right, it's only 10. And you can always view this easily by going to the Flutter Inspector and clicking on this button here. And now you can see the margin for our container at the top and bottom being 50 and the left and right being 10. And you can also see the safe area, which is this box over here as well. Now, instead of symmetric, where you provide the same value for the top, bottom, and the same value for left and right, you can also give it different values for each side. So you can either say from LTRB. So this is left, top, right, and bottom. Left, let's say it's 30, top is 10, right is 50, bottom is 20. Every single side I've given a different margin, and now when I hit save, you can see how our box changes, right? You can see that the left is 30, the top is 10, the right is 50, and the bottom is 20. So this box here is what our margins are doing to our screen. But if you didn't want to have 4 values specified, you can use the only. So saying only, gonna set a margin for the left, which is 30. And now everything else is left as 0, and only the left gets that margin. So there's all sorts of ways that you can do this. Now, what if you wanted to have the child of the container to be a little bit more offset from the edge of the container? In this case, you wouldn't be using the margin, and you would instead be using a padding. So if you've ever worked with CSS or web design, then this will all feel very intuitive to you. And remembering that the Flutter team actually came from a background of web development, this is one of the reasons why it might be so familiar and so intuitive to work with. So for the padding, it also expects an edge inset. So let's go ahead and provide one. And this allows us to set basically different values for the padding for all 4 edges of whatever it is that we're setting it to, which in this case is our container. Let's add a padding for all sides that's 20. And when I hit save, you'll see that I now have a little box inside my container that's limiting the child to this area right here. And if I go ahead and remove all of these guidelines, then you can see that this is what I end up with. I've got a container that's pushed slightly away from the edges of the screen, and I've got its content pushed away from the edges of the container. So margin is for the outside of your widget, and padding is for the inside of your widget. And remember that a container can only have one child, right? So for example, I can't have a piece of text and maybe say an image. That won't work, because remember, the widget itself can only have a single child. So we're only laying out a single child. In the next lesson, we're going to look at some of the ways for laying out multiple children, namely using widgets such as columns and rows. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, it's all very well and good using a container to lay out a single widget, such as a piece of text or an image, and we can define its padding, its margin, its size, its background color, etc. But what if you had lots of different things that you want to lay out relative to each other? Well, in that case, you need something that can take lots of children and not just a single one. And the easiest way to do this is using columns and rows, so that we can lay out our widgets in a vertical direction or a horizontal direction and determine how they should be sized. Going back to our widgets catalog and looking specifically at the layout widgets, we're going to go down to the multi-child layout widget section. And you can see the most commonly used ones to lay out multiple child widgets are rows and columns. Rows go horizontal, columns will go vertical. Let's go ahead and create a column of our own. What if instead of only having a single container, I had lots of different containers? So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the margin and padding so we don't confuse ourselves. And I'm going to name it container 1. So here's container 1 and it's white. And I'm going to collapse my container. So you can see that all the code that's related to setting the properties of our container is all enclosed in these parentheses. And when I click on it, I can expand it, but I can also compress it like this. Instead of having the child of our safe area, so what's inside our safe area, being just a container, I'm going to cut that and paste it down here for a little bit later on. And instead, the child is going to be a column. Now, a column, crucially, doesn't have a child. It has children, because we can put lots of things inside our column. And it's got this angle bracket to tell you that this is actually a list of items that we can put in here. We can put lots of widgets in between these square brackets. And what we're going to start with is that container that we moved out just now. So I'm going to hit Command X to cut and paste it in here. And then I'm going to collapse it down. And at this point, when I hit save, you'll see that nothing much really happens on screen, because we have a column that only really comes into action when you have more than one widget. Let's leave our first container and let's build another container as the second child of our column. Now this container is again going to have a width of 100 and a height of 100. And notice that when you add a comma to the end of, say, every line, and you hit save, it makes it really easy for Dart to know how to lay out your code. Let's also give our container a color so that we can actually see it. So let's change this to a blue color and hit save. And you can see we now have two containers on screen, and I'm going to give this a child, which is a piece of text, and I'm going to tell it to write the words container 2. So we have container 1 and container 2, and I'm simply going to copy this container to create a third one. And our third one is going to be red, and it's going to be container 3. So now we have 3 containers, all 100 by 100, all with different colors, and it's being laid out in a vertical direction, which is because we have all our containers inside a column. Now, our columns will automatically try and take up as much of the vertical space as possible. So if we go into Flutter Inspector and we check out what the column actually looks like, you can see it's this box right here. It's trying to take up all of the space that is available vertically, but horizontally it's limiting itself to the size of its children. We can change this, however. We can change its main axis size, and main axis for a column is of course vertical. So let's change this to the minimum size. And you can see now, when I hit save, my column actually shrinks to be the size that's only required to fit my 3 containers, all of its children. Currently, our column is laying out its children from top to bottom, so container 1, 2, and 3. Now, what if we wanted to go the other direction instead? Well, we can change its vertical direction. We can either change it to go up, which means it goes from the bottom to the top. So here's 1, 2, and 3. Or we can change it as down, which is the default, where it goes from top to bottom. Now, what if you didn't want to change the direction of it, but instead you wanted to change the spacing between our containers? Well, then you would use something called main axis alignment. And by default, all of our containers are aligned to the start. So it's main alignment dot start. And this will try and place the children as close to the start of the main axis as possible. So this is a vertical axis, and this is the start of the vertical axis. However, we can also change it to end. So if we had main axis alignment dot end, then our containers will all be bunched down here towards the end of our main axis. Now, you can also move it all to the center. And you can use a variety of these to determine how you want your screen to be laid out. Now, what if we didn't actually want all of our children to be bunched together like this at the center, at the start, or at the end? What if we wanted them to be spread out a bit more? Well, we can use something that's called space evenly. And this will calculate the amount of free space that the column has, and it'll space all of our children evenly throughout the column. But what if we wanted something to be at the start and something to be at the bottom and then another one in the center? Well, we would then use space between instead. Now, what if I wanted to change the way that my containers are aligned on the horizontal axis? Well, in this case, instead of using the main axis alignment property, I would be using something called the cross-axis alignment. And this is across or perpendicular to the main axis. So for columns, that will be the horizontal. Now here, I also have access to the start cross-axis alignment and also end cross-axis alignment. But you'll notice that if I just go ahead and put this in and I hit save to hot reload, nothing really happens on the horizontal axis. And the reason for this is that my axis alignment is actually trying to align to my children. So that means that, say if I had a child that was much wider, let's say 300 across, then all of my children will align themselves to the right edge of each other. But if they're all the same size, then they're already aligned on the end, so they won't pop over to the right side in this case. Now, if you wanted all your 3 containers to go over to the right, one way of doing this might be creating simply a invisible container where you give it a width of infinity. And to give it a width of infinity, we write double dot infinity. And what this will do is it will create a container down here. You can see it has no height, so it's just got a width, and it's as wide as the screen will allow it to be. So if I give it a small height so that you can see it more easily, in this case it's just this last bit. it doesn't have a color, so it's completely invisible, but it pushes all of our children to the right because we're now all aligning to the end of our column on the horizontal axis, and one of our containers is as wide as the screen allows. Now, what if instead of doing this, you wanted actually to stretch all your containers so that they fill the entire width? Now, you could provide a width for each of the containers to be double dot infinity. So let's change the width to So now all of my containers will stretch to the entire width that's possible. But there's a much easier way of doing this actually, by using a property that comes with our column. And instead of using cross-axis alignment end, we can use cross-axis alignment stretch. And this will stretch our children so that they can be the best versions of themselves, or in this case, actually stretch them across the screen. So you can see that even though I've reloaded, everything looks exactly the same. And I no longer need to provide a width property for my containers because it's being stretched by its parent, the column. Now, what if you wanted a little bit of spacing between your containers? Because at the moment, they're all very much in each other's business and right next to each other with no space in between. Well, if you knew exactly how much space you want to have between your containers, you can use a sized box. And a sized box can have a height and a width, of course, but in the case of where it's being put inside a column, which is aligned vertically, then we only really need to provide a height. So we can give it a height of 20 and leave its width property as 0. And you can see this goes in here between container 1 and container 2 and gives us a little bit of spacing between those two things. And it helps us when we want a little bit of space between our children. Now, everything that I've spoken about columns also apply to rows. So in fact, I can straight up just change our column to a row, and you'll see it does exactly the same thing on the horizontal axis. So in this case though, we're saying that the cross-axis alignment, so for a row, the main axis is of course horizontal, but the cross-axis alignment, so the vertical alignment, has to be stretched, so all our containers are stretched vertically. And for all the children, they each have a height, which doesn't really get taken into account anymore because it's being stretched. But we can also give it a width, for example. So let's say we give it a width of 30 for the first one. You can see that gets affected because my containers are being aligned on the horizontal axis. Now you can see that my sized box disappeared. Well, it's because I'm giving it a height, but that doesn't really matter when it doesn't have a width. So in a row, in order to give it space, we're going to be using a size box with a width in order to give it a little bit of spacing. So the best way of getting to know columns and rows and containers is really to try it out for yourself. So in the next lesson, I've got a challenge for you. I've got a layout that I want you to replicate using containers, columns, and rows and everything that we've learned about so far. Now, while you're playing around with this, as humans, we tend to be quite visual, and it's usually easier for us to see what something will do before actually writing out the code. So I recommend pulling up this Flutter layout cheat sheet that's created by Tomic, and I'll of course link to it in the course resources. And what he's done is he's taken things such as the column and row, and he's tried to show you what it looks like before you write the code. So in this case, when you use main alignment.start on a column, this is what it looks like. When you use main alignment.start on a row, this is what it looks like. And you can see that he's put in all of the things that we've talked about, at least for columns and rows, and you can identify it visually before you commit it into writing the code. In order to complete the challenge, head over to the next lesson and check out the layout that I want you to achieve. and then go ahead and write the code yourself and see if you can make it work and make it look exactly the same. So I'll see you on the next lesson. Now let's get started building our final product, which is our business card of sorts, but in an app. Now you can see that the layout naturally goes from top to bottom. So the most appropriate layout widget that we're going to be using is, of course, a column. And inside our column, we'll have maybe something that can display an image in a circle, a bit of text that shows our name, a little bit about what we do, and then maybe a horizontal line to separate this top part with the bottom part, which are these two sort of material cards, if you will, that show our phone number and our contact details. Let's get started making this using what we've just learned. So I'm going to delete everything from the end of the row, where it says here with that comment, all the way to the start of the row. And instead, I'm going to have a column. Now, my column, of course, needs to have that children parameter. And now I get to specify what children I want inside my column. The first child is going to be something called a circle avatar. And you can see that if you hover on this and wait for it, it'll show you the quick docs. And it tells you that if you choose this one, you will get a circle that represents a user, typically used with a user profile image, and the image will be cropped to have a circle shape. So even though we're not really building a profile, in this case, it still makes sense to use this widget so that we get our image automatically filled into a circle. And there's lots of these widgets that the Flutter team have created for common use cases, such as building out a user profile or whatever it may be. And we're going to explore some of those already in this module. What are the sort of things that we can put in a circle avatar? Well, if you click on the circle avatar, and if you're on a Mac, if you hit Control J, or if you're on Windows, you hit Control Q, you'll end up with the quick docs. Now, the quick docs will show you what are all the things that you can set about this circle avatar, including its background color, its child, so something it contains, a background image or a foreground color, or the radius. We're going to keep ours really simple. We're going to give it a radius, and it's just going to be 50. So this is going to show up just as a simple circle with the default blue color. Now, the next thing we're going to change about it is I don't like it being blue. So what if I wanted to specify a color? So let's give it a background color of, I don't know, let's say red. So I can change all of these properties that I discover through using my quick docs, and depending on what it is that you want to set for the radius or the image, then you can customize your widgets like so. Instead of having a background color, as a challenge, I want you to figure out how you can add a picture of yourself or an image that you find on the internet, and you're going to set up your assets to be able to display that image inside the circle avatar. So through the use of quick docs and what you've learned before, try and complete this challenge and see if you can turn it into a circle like this with your own custom picture. All right, I hope you gave that a go and you remembered how to do it. But here on my desktop, I've got a picture of myself, and I'm going to rename it to make my life a little bit easier later on, so I don't have to type out all of that when I try to add my picture to my code. So I'm just going to call it Angela, and I'm going to keep the extension. In this case, the picture is actually a JPEG. Then I'm going to go into my Flutter project, and I'm going to create a new directory, and I'm going to call this images. So now I'm going to drag and drop my image into the images folder, and then click OK when I get prompted. At this point, because we got our project off of GitHub, it asks us whether we want to track the changes that we're making to this project. And you can go ahead and click yes. Here we've got our image, and it's now inside our project under a folder called images. This is the perfect time to go into our pubspec.yaml and clean up a lot of these comments, and then we can go ahead and add in the parts that we need. So remember, the comments start with a # or a hashtag, if you will, and try to not accidentally delete parts that are not comments, like the SDK, because otherwise you might end up with some problems. So I'm also going to delete all of this, but I'm going to go ahead and add my image asset in here. So I'm going to select all of that, and I'm going to hold down Command or Control and hit the / button. Now, remember that our YAML file is really delicate about how we indent it. So the assets has to be on the same line as the user's material design because it's a child of our Flutter settings. And then the image that we want is going to be indented by 2 spaces. So you can hit the spacebar twice or hit the tab button if you want to. Now, inside our images folder, I've got an image called angela.jpg. Now yours might be called something else. And then we're going to run packages.get to add those images to our project. So now we're ready to change our circle avatar. Instead of having a background color, we're going to have a background image instead. And our image is going to be an asset image. And the name of the image is, of course, images/angela.jpg. Let's hit save, and we should see our image show up in our little circle avatar here. Brilliant. Did you manage to get that right? If you have any trouble with the asset image and also understanding how the pubspec.yaml works, be sure to review the lesson where we talked all about how to import images into our project assets, where we go into that in more detail. Now that we've set up our circle avatar, the next step is to add our name to our business card, right? And so I'm going to add a text widget, and the text it's going to contain is simply going to be my name. At this stage, you can see that the text shows up in the default layout. So it's just a piece of black text in the default font. It'll just be a piece of small text that's in black that shows up in our column underneath the previous child. Now, what if we wanted to style it up a little bit? What if we wanted to customize the styling of our text? Well, we can take a look at the piece of text, hit Control-J or Control-Q, and see what other things that we can change about it. Well, we can change the data that goes in. So in our case, it's Angela U. We can change the style of it. Wait, that seems like what we want, right? So we have to set a property called style, and it's going to be of type text style. So let's try that. Let's add the style property, and let's change it to a text style. Now, what kind of things can we do with text style? Well, Android Studio is very helpful in pointing out we can set the color, the font size, the font weight, font style, letter spacing, all of these things. And let's start by changing the font size. And I'm going to change it to a 40-point font. And I'm going to hit save so we can see what it looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good size-wise. And then I'm going to change the color. I want it to be a white color. So let's write colors.white to get our material palette and change it to white. Yeah, it's looking instantly better. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make it bold. So I'm going to write font weight, and I'm going to write font weight dot bold. And now let's hit save, and you can see that we now have a bolded piece of text that's going to represent our name. Now, the only difference between how it looks in our project and how we want it to ultimately look is that this is a different font. So how can we incorporate our custom fonts into our project rather than just using the system default fonts? Well, to find out about that, you'll have to head over to the next lesson. Now, in the original mockup of our design, we wanted to have a nice fancy font for the part where we display our name. Now, how do we add a custom font to our project? Well, the first part is, of course, downloading and getting hold of a font. And the easiest way of doing that is simply heading to fonts.google.com. And the reason why is because all of these fonts here are free for commercial use. So no matter where you're using it on a website or of course in your Flutter app, you can use it without fear that somebody will come after you because of copywriting. So now you get to look through all of these fonts, around 900 of them, and decide which one do I like? What looks nice to me? Or if you're more of a designer and you know exactly what kind of category you're looking for, say a display type of font, then you can uncheck all the other ones and find the one that you want. Now, the one that I'm going to use is something called Pacifico. And this is a font that looks a bit like handwriting. And it looks really pretty, especially when it's contrasted with a normal sort of sans serif font. So this is exactly what we're going to do. And in order to download it, we're going to select this font and we're going to hit the download button. Now we have a zip file. And once you unzip it, then you can see that here's the font, the TTF file format. And here is the license that allows you to use it for commercial use. In order to add this to our project, we're going to do a little bit more dragging and dropping. Again, inside my project, I'm going to create a new directory called fonts. And here, if I have more than one font, I'm going to drop them all in here. So I'm going to drag my Pacifico and drop it into fonts and hit OK. And we're going to add the file to Git as well. And you can see that in the preview, it shows us what this font looks like. And it looks pretty beautiful. And we're going to use it to reformat our font for our text widget here. So again, we have to go into our pubspec.yaml. And in addition to assets, we're also going to have some fonts. Now, previously, before we deleted all the comments, you might remember that there was a comment about how to add custom fonts. And they even point you towards a part of the documentation where it talks about how to use custom fonts. So if you head over to this address, then you can see that it takes you to this page that tells you all about how you can use custom fonts in your project. And we've already imported our font files. So now all we have to do is declare the font in the pubspec.yaml. And the reason why I'm taking you over here is because the YAML file indentation is super important and it's really easy to get it wrong. So instead, what I recommend is just to simply copy all the parts that you need. We've already got the part that says Flutter because we already have some assets in it. And then we're going to hit copy and we're going to go back and we're going to paste it right underneath here. So now you can see our fonts is indented by 2 spaces from our Flutter settings. And then inside our fonts, we've got our font family and we've got our fonts and we've got our font asset. So now all we need to do is to change the family to the name of our font family, which in this case is Pacifico. And then we're going to change the location of our asset, which is inside a folder called font, and it's called pacifico-regular.ttf. So I can change this word, Pacifico, and that's all we need to do. And this is more of a foolproof way of getting our fonts loaded up into our project. And when we run package.get, you should see that everything in here is black and white. But if we had an indentation issue, then when we run this, you might get some errors like this, telling you that this part here where it says fonts, it's not what it expected. So indentation matters a lot. And the easiest way of getting this right is to actually just copy it from the source. This makes it so much less error prone. So now that we've got our Pacifico font loaded into our project, from now on, we can refer to it by this name that we specify here. So the Pacifico font family. So let's go back into our main.dart. And for the style property of our text, we're going to also update its font family. And here we can specify the name that we typed into the pubspec file, which was Pacifico with a capital P. And now that I've added in our new resource, we actually have to rebuild our project from cold. So I had to hit stop and then hit play so that it links up all the necessary things that we need. And you can see that our new font gets added in and it looks great. It looks a lot better than the default font that we had to begin with. So now, as a challenge, I want you to apply what you just learned and create the next part of our user interface, which is a piece of text still in our column that describes your role. So it could be Flutter developer, project manager, designer, whatever it may be. But you're going to make it all caps, and you're going to change the font to something called Source Sans Pro. And you can find it on Google Fonts. Try and pause the video and apply those changes so that we can update the next part of our business card. All right, so we're just going to do exactly what we did previously. We're going to add our Source Sans Pro to our selection, and then we're going to download it so that we have access to it locally. And then we're going to unzip that file. Once you've extracted it and you can see all the different types, we're actually just going to drag in the Source Sans Pro regular, and we're going to drop it into our fonts folder. And then we're going to click OK to move it, and we'll be able to see an excerpt of what it looks like. So now we can go into our pubspec.yaml, and we can copy what we did for the Pacifico font family, and we can paste it right below, but at the same indentation level where the family is. So now, essentially what we're saying is that for the custom fonts that we want to use in our Flutter app, there are two families. One is Pacifico and the other is going to be Source Sans Pro. And we can change the asset location to Source Sans Pro-regular and just check to make sure it's the same spelling. And now if we go ahead and click on packages.get, we'll be able to pull in those files to use in our main.dot. Right below our previous text widget, we're going to add our next text widget. And this one is simply going to say your job title. So it could be, I don't know, Flutter developer, or it could be designer, whatever it may be. And then we're going to set the style to a text style that uses the font family that we named just now, which was called Source Sans Pro. And it's really important that this part has to match exactly what you wrote here. So including all the spaces and the upper and lower casing. So you're essentially referring to something inside the fonts with a family name of Source Sans Pro, and by linking it up previously, we already told it that this is where that font resides and where it should look to. Now that we've added in our font family, the rest of it, it's really up to you how you want to style it. Personally, for me, I'm going to change the color to a light teal. So I'm going to go into colors, and then I'm going to go into teal, and then I'm going to specify maybe the 100 shade. Now, you might have noticed that there's lots of ways that you can do this. So when I write teal and my little dock pops up, you can see that there's teal from 50 all the way down to 900. And that's kind of the dark or deepness of the shade. But instead of adding in the square brackets, I can also just write a dot and specify my shade. As in, if I want shade 100, then I can just simply do that. So this is what we've got so far. And the font's a little bit too small for my eyes. I think I'm getting a bit old. Can't actually see it that well. So I'm going to increase the font size to maybe a 20-point size. And I'm also going to change something called letter spacing. So this property will determine how much space there is between each of the letters in the word. And I'm going to say maybe 2.5. So a lot of these things you can have a play around with it and see how it looks to you. I think one last thing that I would do to this is I would probably make the font weight bold. And that will probably make it look just how I would like it. The styling is of course up to you, but this lesson is all about making sure that you've understood how to incorporate custom fonts into your Flutter app and how we can use the pubspec to specify what our font is called and where it is located inside our project, and then using packages.get to grab it. Now, if you had any problems with indentation, be sure to take a look at this file over here and just notice that every single indent is actually 2 spaces, and it's 2 spaces from the left, and it's 2 spaces for every child. Now, this is really important. So if you have any errors when you run it, this is the first thing to check. I'll include this file as a download for this lesson, just in case you mess up all the indentations and you just want a quick way of fixing it. In the next lesson, we're going to be looking at how we can add icons that are ready made and ready to go into our app. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so we've already gotten pretty far, but the next thing that I want to create are these little boxes. These boxes that contain an icon and also a phone number or an email address, whatever it is that you want to show. Now, you can use an image asset as an icon, but it's nowhere near as adaptable as simply using an icon widget. And I want to show you how this works. If we collapse both of our text widgets and our circle avatar, then we can see that in our column, we currently have 3 things: our circle avatar, our text, which is our name, and finally the job title that we have here. So I'm going to go ahead and add another child, and this is going to be a container. Now, inside this container, the only child that it's going to have is a row. And very often when you're creating user interfaces in Flutter, you'll find yourself embedding rows inside columns or columns inside rows. And this gives you that kind of grid layout pattern that makes your layout really flexible. We're going to have a 4th child, which is going to be a row. And this row is going to have a whole bunch of children, including an icon. Now, an icon is a class that is drawn instead of being shown. So for an image, it's simply displayed as is. But for an icon, it's actually drawing all of the sides and the edges onto the screen. What this allows you to do is you can, on the fly, for example, change the color of the icon or the size of the icon. And it's so much more flexible than simply just using an image. And by using the material.dart package from Flutter, you already have access to a whole bunch of icons that Google made. So if you take a look at the documentation for the icons class, icons with an S, you can see that you have all of these icons at your fingertips, and they come from the material design icons. So these are icons that designers at Google actually created so that you can have a consistent theme across apps that are built with the material design look. The way that I prefer to browse icons is actually using a tool called materialpalette.com. And not only is this really good for coming up with really intelligent, beautiful color palettes. So for example, on the main page, if you select 2 colors that you quite like, for example, teal and say yellow, then it'll automatically generate you a 8-color color palette, even complete with an accent tone. And you can see it looks really, really nice straight up from the get-go. And it also has the colors that we've been using so far and gives you their names all in one place. And if you click on them, it'll show you all the various shades that you can tap into. There's also a 3rd tab, which are the icons. And it's a really easily searchable place where you can say, let's look for an add icon. And it shows you, here are all the ones that you could possibly use. And when you find one of them, you can see it has a name, right? This one's called add_shopping cart. So I can simply go into my Flutter app and write icons, which is the name of the class that supports material design icons, .add shopping cart. And now, almost immediately, you can see that I can add that icon that I found on here to my app, which is brilliant if you don't want to spend a lot of time finding or creating or paying for these design resources. Now, I mentioned that icons are better than images because they're drawn on the fly. So let me show you what you can do with these icons that you can't do with images. I can, for example, turn that icon into a much larger icon by simply changing its size property. So let's make it 100. And you can see that almost immediately my icon becomes super large and the lines get thicker and it scales until infinity. So if I change this to 1,000, you'll see that it won't pixelate because it's actually just drawn. All that happens is that it goes off the screen and you get these yellow bars as a warning to tell you that there's parts of your content that's not visible to the user. It's completely off the screen. But you can see that this icon doesn't become pixelated. Whereas if I did that to my image up here, so let's say I make that circle avatar 1000 in its radius, then you can see that my picture becomes a little bit pixelated. And let's go a little bit more extreme. Let's add another 0 to that. And now it's completely not interpretable. I can't really tell what that is anymore, even though I know it's hair. This is the reason why icons are much better, because they're vectors and you can even change their color on the fly. Let's change the color of my icon to that teal color that we've been using. Let's hit save and you can see it now blurs into the background. But if I change that into a 900 shade and hit save, then you'll see it's become a much darker teal and now it's completely visible. So you can change the color of it, you can change the size of it, you can do all sorts of things with these icons that you can't do with images. And this is why they're really, really useful inside your app. All right, so the icon that we actually want here is the one called phone. And this one gives us that little phone icon that we can put next to some piece of text. So in addition to the icon, I'm also going to have some text. And this is simply going to be, say, a phone number. So +44 123 456 789, for example. And then I'm going to style up my text because at the moment it looks a bit boring. So I'm going to give it a text style. And this is going to have a color, which is going to be a dark teal color. So colors.teal.shade 900. And then it's going to have a font family of the same one that we've been using, which is Source Sans Pro. And we're going to change the font size to 20 points. And let's hit save and see what that looks like. All right, so that looks pretty nice, but it'd be nice if there was a little bit of space between the icon and the text, right? Well, we know that we are inside a row, and the way that we can easily add space between our children in our rows is by adding a sized box. So we're going to add a sized box, and we're going to give it some dimension in the horizontal axis, right? Because we're in a row, so it's going to go from left to right. So we'll give it a width. And let's give it a width of maybe 10 points, and that should be enough to separate those out a little bit, make it look just that bit nicer. So finally, I'm going to give my container a color just so that it'll show up as a separate piece of information from the rest of my widgets. So let's give this a color of white, and let's hit save. And now I have to change my icon back into teal so that it's visible. And I can make it come away from the edges of the screen a little bit by adding margin. So a lot of the widgets inside Flutter will have margin or padding as properties that you can change. And they all work exactly the same way as we saw earlier with the columns and the rows. We use edge insets. And I'm going to add edge insets only that are different for the top and bottom and also left and right. So I'm going to use symmetric, and I'm going to say that the vertical sides, so the top and bottom, are going to have 10 points of margin, and the horizontal is going to have 25 points of margin. Now you can see that our container comes away a little bit from the edges and it looks just a little bit better. And our container also has padding. So let's add maybe 10 pixels of padding to all four sides. And now we have our little card, right? As a challenge, I want you to create the other container, the one where you have your email address and an email icon. So I want to challenge you to use the Flutter documentation and also what you learned in this lesson to create that second card. Pause the video and give that a go now. Okay, so we know that we need another container, right? It's pretty much the same as this one. So let's find out where our container ends. It's right about here. And let's go ahead and collapse it. And then we're going to add another container underneath it. And this one is also going to have the same amount of padding. So that was edge insets all with 10 points. And then it's going to have a margin of symmetric margin with 10 on the vertical and 25 on the horizontal. And finally, it's going to have some content. And the content is going to be under the child property. And it's going to be a row that we want to create. The row is going to have some children. And these children include an icon that comes from the icons class, and you can either scroll through this to find an icon that looks right, but in this case it's going to be email. Or you can take a look at the websites that we spoke about earlier on. Now that I have my email icon in there, I'm going to change the styling of that icon to make it look a bit more like the other one. So I have to change its color to teal. And then I get to add my text, which can really say anything you want it to. But in my case, I'm going to add maybe an email. Let's say angela@email.com. And then I'm going to change its style to have a text style. And maybe we'll go for a font size of 20 to match with the other one. A color of teal 900, and the font family is of course also going to be Source Sans Pro. And let's hit save and let's see if we get what we wanted. Okay, so we can see that the icon has disappeared, so it's the same color as the background. We've got our text formatted in the same way as the previous one, and all we have to do now is to give our container a white background. And it should show up underneath the other one and show us what else is missing. So the only thing that looks odd to me here is just a little bit of space between the icon and the text. So to do that, we have to add our sized box with a width, and that was going to be 10. And now if we hit save, then it's starting to look pretty good. In the next lesson, we're going to finalize this app, and we're going to make these info sections a little bit nicer looking using a Flutter widget called Card. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now we can see that our design is really coming together and it's looking already pretty nice. But there's just a few things that look a little bit different for our info sections here compared to what we initially wanted. And these are really subtle things, like maybe a little bit of rounding of the corners or a little bit of shadow under the white part to make it feel like it's popping out of the page a little bit. So we can either try and customize what we have to make it look like this, or we can simply use a pre-built widget class called Card. And you might have seen this in a lot of the apps that you use from day to day, especially the ones from Google. This is a very, very subtly shadowed rectangle, and it has a small curve to all four edges, and it has a decent amount of padding so the content's centered on the card. And we can create this really, really simply by using the card widget. Let's swap out our containers for a card widget instead. And the first thing that you'll notice is that we have some red lines. And that's because the card widget doesn't actually have a padding property. So let's go ahead and delete the padding that we've set for both of those. But other than the padding, everything else is perfectly valid. Cards have a margin that you can set. It has a child that can contain items inside here. And if I hit save right now, you can see that our info sections automatically start looking like cards. Now, the only problem is that our cards don't have any padding. So what can we do when we have a widget that doesn't actually have a property that we want to change? Because padding doesn't exist for card. But if you look through the Flutter documentation, you might come across something called the padding class. And this is a widget that can be added as a parent to any other widget, and it'll give it some padding. And this is how you might use it. So you could have a padding widget as the parent to a card widget, and now you end up with some padding around it. Now, the way that you use padding is quite interesting. Let's go ahead and add our padding. And we're going to do it around our row because we're going to pad out our row inside our card. So I'm going to select or put my cursor on the row widget, and I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and hit Enter to pull up the Intention Actions menu. And I'm going to select Wrap with New Widget. And that new widget is, of course, going to be padding. And padding, of course, has a padding property, and we're going to set it to Edge Insets All with 25 points of padding. Now you can see that we have all this massive space around our row. So the padding goes around its child. It's almost like we're adding a soft blanket around whichever widget it is that we've wrapped our padding. In our case, that's our row. And so the row now exists inside a 25-point padding. Now, what would you think would have happened had we put our padding around our card instead? Well, in that case, we can remove our widget from our row and we can add it to our card, and you can see that adding padding around widgets is such a common action that you can actually select it in this menu already. And you can select that and it comes pre-built with a certain amount of padding. So let's change that to 25. And you can see that when the padding goes around the card, it doesn't actually achieve what it is that we wanted, which is to get a slightly larger card with a bit of space between the edges of the card and the actual content. But in this case, what's actually happened is the padding has gone around our card, and it almost looks like we've added margins around our card. It's important to remember that when you're adding padding, the child of the padding widget is going to get a blanket essentially wrapped around it and separated from everything else. I'm going to go ahead and delete that padding. And I want to show you that not only can we use the card widget to make our lives easier, we can even get rid of our row widget by using something that's used very commonly with cards in Flutter. And it's used so commonly that they even mention it in the documentation. Whenever you're looking at documentation on the Flutter website, there's usually a section called See Also. And this very helpfully points you towards other widgets that are used really commonly with this widget. And here it points to something called a list tile. And this displays icons and text in a card. Well, that sounds pretty much like what we need, right? So let's click on it and see what it does. This is a single fixed height row that typically contains some text as well as a leading or trailing icon. So that sounds like a much more convenient way of implementing all of this. Instead of having our row, we're going to use this list tile instead. So I'm going to cut the row out and I'm going to paste it at the bottom for reference. And inside my card, as a child, I'm going to add a list tile. And you can see that list tiles have a number of properties. The leading area, which is on the left of that row, the title, which is a bit of text that we could put. It could also have a subtitle, and finally a trailing icon. Let's add our list tile and let's give it a leading widget which is going to be our icon. So I'm going to take all of my icon and I'm going to paste it inside here. So let's get rid of that duplicate comma. And now we can add a title to our list tile. And that title is of course going to be our text. So from the bottom part of our text to the top, I'm going to paste that inside here. And now we have a list tile and a piece of text, and we can delete the rest of this. So that's a lot shorter. If you hit save and you take a look at the result, you can see that it's already got a bit of space between the leading icon and the title. And we've got a little bit of padding around our list tile, and it looks pretty great already. So as a challenge, try and reformat the other list tile so that it does exactly the same thing, and have a look through the documentation for the list tile to see what other things you can customize about it. The only other thing that we need to change here is this card. And this card currently has a row in it, which we're going to remove. So we're going to find the row comment and cut out this row, paste it at the bottom in case we need it. And then we're going to add a list tile as the child. And it's going to have a leading widget, which is going to be our icon. So icon, let's put that in here. And delete the extra comma. And then it's also going to have a title, which is going to be our text widget here. And let's paste that in there. Now we can delete all of this and we can hit save. Cards by default come with a white color. So we can delete this color property without it changing anything about our card. And you can see that we now have this vastly simplified code because we're able to use pre-built widgets that conform to the material design principles. And all we had to do is to figure out which widget to use and how we want to set its properties. And through this, we're able to customize the appearance of these widgets to our liking. All that we have to do now is to get our column to be centered. So do you still remember how to do that? See if you can challenge yourself to find that out from the column documentation. See if you can figure out how to center our content for our column. Let's head over to our column class, and you might already remember this from our previous lessons on the column, but one of the most important things that you can set is the cross-axis alignment and the main axis alignment. So the main axis determines how the children should be placed along the main axis, which in the case of a column is of course along this axis. So that is the one that we want to make centered. So let's find out where we created our column, and then right underneath it, we're going to add our main axis alignment, and we're going to change it to center. And now all of our items will get pushed right into the middle, and it starts looking a lot more like a little business card. So now the final thing that we need to add is a little line between this section and this section to separate it. And to do that, we're going to add a sized box, because this is a really easy way of adding something with a fixed height inside our column. And I'm going to give it a height of just 20 points. And then I'm going to give it a child. And the child is going to be our horizontal line. So in web design, you have something called the horizontal rule, which creates a single horizontal line. But in Flutter, we have something called a divider. And the divider class simply puts a 1 pixel thick horizontal line onto our screen. Let's add that as the child. And let's change its color to maybe a nice light teal color. And you can see that we now have this line going from edge to edge. Now, what if we want it to be just a little bit shorter? Well, we can actually change the size of our sized box, because at the moment its width is as wide as the screen. What if we change the width instead to 150 pixels? Now our line gets just a little bit shorter, and it's just enough to separate our top group and our bottom group. So in this module, we explored a number of widgets, including layout widgets such as containers, columns, and rows, but also customizable widgets such as a circle avatar or the card widget or a list tile. And we looked at how we can use the documentation to see what properties of these widgets we can set and customize them to our liking. Finally, we also learned about how to use custom fonts and icons to make our design come to life. So now it's truly your time to update this app, to make it your own. So personalize it for yourself. Change it to have your details or your job description or whatever it is that you want to change about this. And once you're done, be sure to share it with the community and everybody else who's taking the course along with you using the hashtag #FlutterBrew. And I look forward to seeing all of your amazing creations. So that's all from me for this module. I'll see you on the next one.